You may not be able to see me from behind the screens, but I promise I'm here at the podium. If we could ask everyone to just stand up for a second, stretch it out. Grab any beverages, last-minute desserts that you'd like before we start the keynote. I actually don't know when they're starting the webcast. Okay, for real this time, good afternoon. Please take your seats. Please go ahead and take your seats. We're on a webcast. I know, it's like the webcast is here, so. Yeah, but because it's going to be AV heavy, that's why the screens are there so they can see her slides. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with our keynote speaker. I can't see you anymore, but I can still hear you. Excellent. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Dr. Audrey Singer. Dr. Singer is a senior fellow at the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. Her areas of expertise include demography, international migration, U.S. immigration policy, and urban and metropolitan change. She has written extensively on U.S. immigration trends, including immigrant integration, undocumented migration, naturalization and citizenship, and the changing racial and ethnic composition of the United States. Her co-edited book, 21st Century Gateways, Immigrant Incorporation in Suburban America, focuses on the fastest growing immigrant populations among second-tier metropolitan areas, including Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Dallas, Minneapolis-St. Paul, Sacramento, and Charlotte. Dr. Singer earned a PhD in sociology with a specialization in demography from the University of Texas at Austin. She has an MA in sociology from the University of Texas at Austin and a BA in sociology from Temple University. She conducted postdoctoral research at the University of Chicago, and what she loves most about the Washington, D.C. area is exploring the experiences of everyday life through the hyperdiverse mixture of people in the shadow of the nation's capital. So I know you'll enjoy her keynote as much as I will, and it is my great pleasure to bring you Dr. Audrey Singer.
Well, I'm here hidden behind the screens. So I'm going to come out just so you can see me. It's going to be hard for me to see all of you, but. I am truly delighted to be here, and I want to thank Ariana, Camille, Blair, and staff of both of the institutions that they are affiliated with for inviting me to talk with you today. And this morning has been exhilarating in many ways for us. The level of engagement, the richness of the discussions, the places we've gone, the people we've seen, it's really been remarkable. So I thank you all for that. And I'm thanking you in advance for listening to this talk after lunch. So I'm going to talk a lot about research that I've done over the years on immigration to the Washington metropolitan area. And I'll try to hone in on some of the more salient pieces of information that we have out there about the immigrant population here. But looking around the Washington metropolitan area today, with so much diversity in schools and neighborhoods, in commercial corridors, with ethnic shops and restaurants, and in many workplaces, it's hard to imagine a time when the region wasn't the major immigration gateway it is now. If it seems like every fifth person or more was born outside of the United States, it's because they were. 22% of the region's population was born outside of the United States. But this was not always the case, as you'll see. This afternoon, I'll talk about U.S. trans and immigrant settlement and how the Washington Metropolitan region fits into the national historical picture. I'll also talk about the diversity of Metropolitan Washington's foreign-born population, and I'll focus on the metropolitan area's Black immigrants who come from a widely diverse set of origins and are an important source of growth among the immigrant population and among the region's population. I will warn you that you're about to see a lot of numbers, if you can see them. I hope you can. But they tell an important story, that of a remarkable transformation of Washington, D.C., from a smallish city of largely white and Black native-born residents to a major, diverse, multicultural, multi-ethnic immigrant gateway. And what we will discover today further is that the nation's capital truly is a Black mosaic once you probe deeper into the 1.5 million people who check off Black on census surveys. So I'm going to just say a word about what you're going to see. Talking about, for the most part, Metropolitan Washington, which has about 6 million people, 22 jurisdictions. I will also break down some of the information into local jurisdictions. I'm using largely census data. As you've heard, I'm a demographer, so I do a lot of quantitative work, but I'm always on the ground trying to talk to people and get to the bottom of things, but I do rely on numbers. I will talk about immigrants and the foreign-born as the same thing. So anyone born outside of the United States, regardless of their immigration status, they can be a temporary worker, a green card holder, an international student, a naturalized U.S. citizen, undocumented. All of those things are captured in the census numbers that ask about birthplace. But we can't go much further than that. And I will also largely use the term Black. And that, after this morning's discussions, we all know that's very inadequate. But the US government collects information by race. The race question, which I use to identify Black immigrants, refers to people who marked that they were, quote, Black, African American, or Negro. The census asks people to self-identify their race, and it's a question that's been asked since 1790. It wasn't always self-identification. Given the richness of the discussion of today's conference, these categories hardly do the topic justice, but they're very important for research behind public policy decisions, particularly those related to civil rights and those that address racial disparities. So I am going to start with the slideshow. The history of the region, of this region, is distinctly dissimilar to its East Coast neighbors, such as New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Until late into the 19th century, newcomers to Washington were largely domestic migrants, particularly Southern Blacks. By the turn of the 20th century, Washington had one of the largest African American communities in the country. The city was nearly 1/3 Black. And during a time when other cities saw their foreign-born population skyrocket, Washington's immigrant population remained relatively small in comparison. That's because Washington was never a major industrial or commercial center like cities along the eastern seaboard, and thus various waves of immigrants generally found better opportunities in cities to the north, which began to industrialize rapidly in the mid-19th century. As Europeans poured into cities in the Northeast and Midwest for manufacturing jobs, Washington developed as the nation's capital with a consolidation of the federal administration here. So, in terms of immigrants, this is what 1900 looked like. Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, and New York all had populations that were 1/4 to 1/3 foreign-born, while Washington's share was just a sliver of the population at 2%. But at the beginning of the 21st century, these proportions look quite different. Although Chicago, New York, and Boston have remained as continuous immigrant gateways throughout this period, many metropolitan areas in the Great Lakes region and in the Northeast lost their allure as manufacturing jobs have disappeared. So we have a new map of immigration that emerges, but here's what it looked like in 1900. The major immigrant gateways, except for San Francisco, were all in the Midwest or the Northeast. In addition to the ones you just saw, there was New Haven, Springfield, Worcester in New England, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, and Cincinnati in the Great Lakes states, Pittsburgh and Scranton, in addition to Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. There have been major changes in settlement trends across the country, and I'm just going to not do that justice either, but particularly in the past 2 to 3 decades, as immigrants found opportunities, particularly job opportunities, in many places with little history of immigration. Some of this was driven by the construction industry, but other places with diverse industries, including new economy, technology jobs, drew immigrants in great numbers. And the greatest growth we've seen has been in southeastern states, but also in the southwestern states. So the map of the top 20 in 2010 is quite different. It includes many metros in the southwest, such as Las Vegas and Phoenix, Los Angeles, Riverside, and San Diego in Southern California, and up along the northern coast, including San Jose, where Silicon Valley is, and Sacramento, and continuing north up the coast to Seattle. We also see Dallas and Houston in Texas, and metros in the south like Miami, Tampa, and Atlanta now top the list. Washington, D.C., of course, is on the list now. And in fact, it ranks 7th among all large metropolitan areas, behind the mega gateways of New York with 5.5 million immigrants, and Los Angeles with nearly 4.5 million immigrants, and behind Miami and Chicago, which have substantially larger populations, but it's closer in number to Houston, San Francisco, and Dallas-Fort Worth. All of those metropolitan areas have over 1 million immigrants. The result of all of this immigration has been nothing short than transformative. Back in 1970, when nationwide levels of immigration were at their lowest point in US history, the metropolitan area had only about 130,000 immigrants, and they made up less than 5% of the total population. But between 1970 and 80, the number of immigrants nearly doubled to 250,000. And again in the 1980s, the immigrant population nearly doubled again to close to 500,000. In the 1990s, the immigrant population grew by about 60%, and by 2017, fully 17% of the population, the total population, was foreign-born. And then in the last decade or a little bit more, because I'm ending in 2012, which is where the last data point is from census, we've seen remarkable growth, nearly 50% growth in the immigrant population. This was during the decade where we had a recession and when immigration slowed to this country. We saw much lower levels of immigration, and many places had slower immigration than this region or lost immigrants. Altogether during this period, the immigrant population increased tenfold. So we're looking at major changes on the ground. Washington's economic growth, especially impressive after World War II, has been fueled by the expansion of the federal government, and it also began to internationalize with the growth of international organizations such as the World Bank, the Organization of American States, and the International Monetary Fund, all of which established headquarters here. And other organizations, private and government, specializing in foreign policy, security, international development, were attracted to Washington because of the international focus. And add to that, since the 1970s, increasing numbers of foreign students and several waves of refugees, particularly from Southeast Asia and Africa, were resettled in the region. So as these currents converged, the internationalization that began largely with professionals and students broadened as family members and other co-nationals joined family and friends already living here in the nation's capital. Given all of these sources of growth, the composition of the immigrant population is pretty dramatic. The 10 largest countries of origin make up only half of the total. The largest at 14% is El Salvador, with about 170,000 immigrants. In many other metropolitan areas, there's one dominant country of origin. For example, in Miami, it's Cubans, although it's gotten much more diverse there over the last 10, 15 years. In Chicago, it's Mexicans, and Houston, it's also Mexicans, just as a few examples. Following El Salvador, India, 7%, Korea, 5%, Vietnam, Mexico, Philippines, China, each with 4%, and Guatemala, Ethiopia, and Peru each contribute 3%. So if we take a step back to source regions rather than countries, more than 1/3 of all immigrants in metropolitan Washington come from the countries of Asia, and another 1/3 are from Central and South America. But two key source countries of Black immigrants are important to note. Those from Africa, 89% of whom checked off Black on the questionnaire, census questionnaire. They make up 13% of immigrants in the region. And those from the Caribbean are 5%, 73% of whom claim Black identity. So I'll talk about the origin countries of Black immigrants in a bit. But first, a little bit deeper in this. In 1980, there were almost twice as many Caribbean as African immigrants in the Washington region. By 1990, Africans had caught up, and since then their numbers have risen dramatically, doubling in the 2000s and now numbering close to 3 times the Caribbean immigrant population. During this time, economic development in Africa made it possible for more people to migrate to the US, and Washington stands out as an attractive destination for Africans due to its status as the nation's capital and its concentration of international institutions, as well as the cluster of well-regarded universities, with Howard being at the forefront. At the same time, world events shifted the focus of the US refugee resettlement program away from Southeast Asia and the former USSR towards sub-Saharan Africa, allowing a large number of Africans from nations such as Sudan and Somalia to be resettled here. So there are over 150,000 African-born people immigrants in the region now. Another way of looking at Washington's immigrants from those regions is to see how representative they are among the nation's immigrants. So what I'm showing you here, there's a line at the bottom that shows where 3% is. Washington only has 3% of the country's immigrants. So of all the immigrants that live in the US, 3% of them live in Washington, D.C. There's about 40 million immigrants in the US right now. But nearly 1/3 of all immigrants from Cameroon and Sierra Leone live in the region, as do 1/5 of all Ethiopians. So these are countries that are very represented here in high numbers. Those 3 largest Caribbean source countries look very different. Washington has more or less just about its fair share, around 3% of Jamaicans and Trinidadians, and smaller number of Dominicans. So that's a lot of information about where immigrants have come from and where they're from, the ones living here now, but not all immigrants from those regions and countries identify as Black. So let's take a closer look at Black immigrants. More than 200,000 Black immigrants call metropolitan Washington home. The top 3 countries of birth among Black immigrants are from Africa, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Ghana. 3 Caribbean countries are also at the top: Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Haiti. That was a shout out to Roger Mark. I hope he's still here. I can't see him, but I'm glad I can hear him. The diversity of this population makes it difficult to get very detailed statistics, so some of the smaller source countries are grouped together, and if you can read them, they're all listed there, but I think we're going to have this up on the website next week or the week after. The absolute number of Black immigrants has increased greatly in the past several decades. In 1990, there were approximately 70,000 in the region. Perhaps Portia James was using these numbers to develop the original Black Mosaic exhibition, I'm not sure. But these would be the numbers she would have relied on after, well, maybe the 80s, because the data was much slower to come out back then. Now there are 250,000, and the share of the immigrant population that is Black has increased from 12% in 1980 to 17% in 2012. So where do Black immigrants live in the region? How has that changed over time? The residential preferences of Black immigrants have shifted considerably between 80 and 2012, from being highly concentrated in the District of Columbia. I'm sorry, that's a map of the region, and I've clustered the jurisdictions into several categories that I didn't talk about, but you're going to hear about them in a second. Let me show you these pies. So you can see on the left we have 1980, on the right we have 2012, and you can see how residential preferences have shifted over time. In 1980, Black immigrants were highly concentrated in the District of Columbia. 41% lived there, and in the 70s and the 80s. And sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here because I didn't talk about the map. So you don't know that the inner core jurisdictions that I'm talking about are D.C., Arlington, and Alexandria. Nearly half of all of the foreign-born Black population in 1980 lived in those three jurisdictions, and the rest lived outside of that area. But by 2012, only 18% of Black immigrants resided in these same areas, only 10% in the district, even though during this period the absolute numbers rose rapidly. So over that period of time, the proportion of the region's immigrants residing in the inner suburbs, Fairfax, Montgomery, and Prince George's counties, increased from a combined total of 51% to 70%. And then further out is where another 13% of Black immigrants now live. So there's been a lot of growth and a lot of change in where people are living. Likewise, there's some differences in the residential patterns of Black immigrants from Caribbean and African countries across local places. Although there are more Africans overall, Black immigrants in D.C. and Prince George's County are more likely to have Caribbean roots than the other counties, and higher than the metropolitan average of 21%. So the long blue bars are an aggregation of all immigrants from African countries, and the orange bars are those from the Caribbean. I want to talk a little bit about how Black immigrants and native-born Blacks relate to each other in the Washington metropolitan area. Overall, Washington has a large number of Black immigrants, and here you can see there are a lot of different metropolitan areas listed here, and the share of Black residents who are foreign-born is what I'm showing on this graph. So Washington is third in the nation behind New York and Miami in the share of all Black residents who are immigrants. But it also has a large number of US-born Blacks, and larger than a lot of other metropolitan areas, including those that have been here for generations and those who are the offspring of immigrant newcomers. So 15% of the Black population was born abroad in the metropolitan area, and you can see some of the differences in other places across the country. However, within the region, the share of the Black population that was born abroad is very variable and is affected by the residential patterns of African Americans in each city or county in the region. So Prince George's County has the largest number of Black immigrants, 65,000, but the share of its Black population that is foreign-born is only 12% due to the large number of US-born Black residents there. Montgomery County, in contrast, has nearly the same number of Black immigrants, 60,000, but the Black population is 35% foreign-born. So there, 1 in 3 people living in Montgomery County is foreign-born. So the last thing I want to talk about is the role of Black immigrants in the way the region is growing. Overall, the Washington metropolitan area has experienced sustained and large population growth, total growth, over the last several decades. The US-born Black population has grown more slowly in the same period, while the foreign-born Black population has grown more rapidly. So that's what I'm showing here. For metropolitan Washington, the blue bars represent overall total growth of the population. The orange bars in the middle, native Black growth, and the yellow bars at the end are foreign-born Black growth. So you can see the gaps between the bars, how much the foreign-born Black population has grown at a much faster rate. Of course, it's a smaller population, but at a much faster rate than the others. However, these changes in growth have been uneven across local jurisdictions. So here's the district, and famously, the District of Columbia has experienced sustained population decline, only to experience very fast growth very recently, and you see that here. It's the first population growth in 50 years that D.C. has seen. The U.S.-born Black population in the District of Columbia has been on the decline, mainly due to outmigration to other places in the region. And the Black immigrant population at this same time has been growing, first very modestly since 1980, but in this last decade, it's considerably faster growth. And then if you take those inner suburbs, Montgomery, Fairfax, and Prince George's together, you can see that there's population growth across all periods and all three populations, but faster gains among the native-born Black population in the earlier period, and even faster growth rates among the foreign-born Black population more recently. And then just for fun, the outer suburbs, I included them, and these are not even the far, far suburbs, but Loudoun and Prince William, which Prince William has seen a lot of both foreign-born growth and African-American native-born growth, and that combo has really diversified Prince William and making it the first county that does not have a majority. Not the first, one of the first, sorry. First in the region is what I meant. So with all of these statistics and new ways of looking at our metropolitan area, you may be left wondering, what does it mean to be Black in Washington, D.C.? Increasingly, it means you have a pretty good chance, almost 1 in 6, of being foreign-born. And this varies by where you live in the region, but the probability has changed greatly over the past several decades. And so too have the source countries. So as the Black population has grown, it's really diversified tremendously. And this means a lot of changes to neighborhoods, a lot of changes in school districts, more diverse languages and cultures, and sort of general change that goes along with fast growth. So the growth and change of the immigrant population in the Washington metropolitan area has been nothing less than profound. During the past several decades, the sheer size of the immigrant population, notwithstanding the diversity of the origins of Washington's immigrants and the relative success of their integration, make it stand out relative to other metropolitan areas. Within the region, some areas are becoming quite immigrant dense, but they generally tend to be very mixed in terms of national origins, but more uniform in terms of economic status. And part of that is the history, or the lack of history, of immigrant settlement in the region, in older immigrant gateways that have dense urban cores. Think of New York or Chicago, where immigrant enclaves developed early on and maybe have seen successive waves of immigrants coming through there. In terms of immigrants, we don't have the same history here, so they tend to disperse and move to places. I think things are starting to converge over time, over the time that I've been studying this, but we still can't point to the neighborhood that we can identify with one or two particular immigrant groups. So that means that newcomers may not be able to rely on established immigrant enclaves, those that exist in real space, because there are few. And part of the dispersion may be due to the fact that most foreign-born newcomers are making residential choices based on the housing market, access to transportation, school choices, family and social ties, just as the US-born largely do. At this point, most local jurisdictions and many neighborhoods and school districts are dealing with challenges brought on by such rapid and heterogeneous change, some better than others. And in terms of the immigrant population, new residents in this region come with widely varying educational backgrounds, experiences, skills, and English language ability. And I do a lot of comparative work, and what's interesting about living and studying a region is that what I see is relative to many other U.S. metropolitan areas, including those that suffered much greater job loss during the recession, are still struggling to come out of that. There's a lot of economic anxiety that is still present, even in this region, and immigrants will continue to bear some targeting of blame, has been the case historically during economic downturns. But the Washington Metropolitan region can continue to work to be a kind of model of immigrant integration as local organizations, local governments, and communities continue to confront the challenges of immigration in productive and sustainable ways. And so I will leave you with those thoughts, and we're going to have questions. Yeah, thanks. I can come out.
Your data does not present labor market participation, and so I'm curious because we heard earlier that African immigrants in particular are more likely to have higher degrees. I was told there were more doctors from Ghana in D.C. than in Ghana right now. So I'm just wondering, what is that in terms of when you look at the black population as a whole? Where do the Africans fit in relation to African Americans in jobs, income, and those, in terms of socioeconomic status and stratification?
Those are really good questions, and I don't have any specific answers for you because I was just doing a portrait of change and where people live. But what I do know, I think what you're saying generally is true, that a lot of immigrants and refugees come here with a lot of skills. And the truth is that they often have problems entering the labor force and getting jobs for which they were trained for. So it's very common for people who either have their training abroad or have language barriers or other barriers to entering the U.S. job market to be working in jobs that do not measure up to their skill level. So that's why, the common story is you get in a taxi cab and there's an immigrant cab driver and they have a PhD in economics or engineering or something like that, and that's quite common. There are a lot of barriers, and including discrimination based on many factors. So I think there's that issue. So fitting into the labor market, where people enter and where they end up is a great question, and the issue of how to compare different groups is also wonderful. Are there any funders in the room? Because we could take it on. But no, I think these are important questions. Yes. Right. So the question is about Charles County. It's considered perhaps an outer suburb. I could go back to that. It's a small number. I don't have it on the top of my head, but there are immigrants there. But we could talk about it afterwards if you want. Okay, I'll come out to see you. The question about gender, the question is about gender and occupations. And again, this was just a really quick snapshot. I didn't want to go too deep. I was worried about how much time I had and how far we could go. In general, and this is the very top number, they're more or less equal numbers of male and female immigrants in this region. It varies by country of origin. It varies by age as well. And in terms of occupations, I have not been down that path in a long time, so I don't think I could answer it very satisfactorily, but again, we could talk about that afterwards.
Hi, Dr. Singer.
Hi.
Thanks so much for your talk. It's really amazing, actually. So I'm going to ask a theoretical question. One of the last things you said was that the DC metropolitan area could be a potential model, right, for immigrant organization. And I guess I'm wondering, is that because the district and the DC metro area is doing something right? Or is it just the makeup, the specific history that this area has?
Great question. I think part of the answer to that is the fact that it is a big and relatively well-off metropolitan area, that economic opportunities are relatively plentiful here, and that really helps. If people are able to work, then it definitely makes things better for immigrants and their families, and also for public responses to immigration. It can also cause a lot of friction. I guess one of the things I had in mind when I said that is the fact that this is a place where a lot of people come together from very mixed backgrounds in various institutions and communities. And it's partly because of the lack of residential enclaves. I mean, people still may be working in more segregated kinds of contexts. But I think in schools, particularly in the suburbs, when you go into an elementary school and you see the number of languages, you see the diversity of the students and their parents, it does make you think about the future. It does make you think about what the next generation, having had these experiences, will know and take as a matter of, just being, life. That people are from very different backgrounds. And I did a lot of work in Prince William County, which saw really big changes in the last 20 years. First, with a big flow of native-born African Americans that moved there, and that followed by immigrants, a lot of them from Latin America, but also from Asia and Africa. And the schools are kind of where this is playing out. I mean, in every jurisdiction here that is true. But in a place like that, you really see it, and you really do think about how these experiences shape outcomes and how these experiences shape the next generation. So in that sense, I think there's a model. It's not like you can tell people where to live, though. Like, hey, mix it up. So, but I will say that Washington, along with other places that had this kind of delayed attraction to immigrants. So Ariana mentioned the book I did where it was an edited volume where there were chapters on places that were a lot like this, very suburban, very automobile-oriented, very dispersed immigrant populations, very suburban immigrant populations, not a strong residential core in most of these places, small residential cores. So, these are places that are sort of changing the way we think about immigration and the way we think about places, particularly suburbs.
Audrey, we have a question over here.
Hi. I'm a former director at Centronia here in the city, and I work on a street that's a real hotbed of NGOs. And one of the first things when I came here from New York, it hit me that NGOs, in spite of this, the notion of enclaves, NGOs provide an opportunity and a pathway for immigrants to come in terms of identity building, sense of solidarity, political activism, and advocacy. And as someone who came out of the civil rights movement, I feel like where are NGOs? And I see this so strongly in the immigrant community. I just wondered if you could comment on that.
Sure. Well, you're part of a group of NGOs that has been so important for not only immigrants in the district, which is where a lot of the organizations, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, legal services organizations got their start because of the early settlement of immigrants in the district. But many of them are finding outposts in the suburbs. Centronia also, is that right? Yes. So Mary Center, Centronia, there are places that over time have developed, have seen the need through the dispersion of immigrants in places where the lack of resources are much greater for people who don't speak the English language, who have other kinds of barriers, economic, transportation, cultural, to different things. Healthcare is a big issue among various immigrant communities. So the need right now may be more acute in suburban areas. And what's interesting is that a lot of the organizations are still, at their core, serving populations in the city. People come in for the services and in some ways prefer to come in to have services with an organization, with people they trust, where they know they can be heard and understood. So I think the suburban challenge is huge, and it's big not just in Washington, but it's big across the board in metropolitan areas. Poverty, the increase in poverty in the suburbs, it has been one of the most startling things about the last 10 or 15 years. Immigrants are probably a small part of that, but the lack of resources and the lack of response in suburban areas, I think, is very acute, especially post-recession. So thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, we have a question here, and then I think there was one over there. Yeah.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for your talk. I had a question. It was kind of a piggyback on the last question, and it was essentially about what you imagine to be some of the political ramifications of the changing demographics. Whereas, do you imagine that we'll see further along changes in representation, changes in the importance of particular NGOs versus other ones, right? So if you could just speak a little bit about what the demographics will mean politically essentially for representation of people in the region.
Great question. Well, political representation notoriously lags behind change, right? And so one of the big challenges in a sort of multi-ethnic, racial, diverse place like this is how do you get to the table? And who gets there first? And how do you come together on that? And I think that's something that this region is going to struggle with. I think there are signs that the struggles may not be as strong here. But I guess one of the first avenues of political representation in terms of elected and appointed officials happens through school boards and the educational process. And so we see that happening in the suburbs among certain immigrant groups. A couple of studies, I think Michael Jones Correa, who was here at the Wilson Center, studied suburbs in this region and the political participation of immigrants. And so that's one source to look at. But it's a defining notion for any group and for any region to have representation among people that are newcomers or ethnic and racial groups. So thank you.
I wanted to know how children were counted on your survey. If two immigrants gave birth, is that child an American? Is it native born or is it a foreign born? And if an American and a foreign born give birth, is that baby an American or is it foreign born? And also, in your South Central American count, how many of those were Afro-Latinos?
All great questions. Let me answer the last one first. I don't remember. It's not very big, but I have that number in my folder somewhere. And I knew somebody was going to ask that, and I was trying to remember it, but I don't actually remember. And in terms of citizenship, so there are two things to consider here. One is the law, and two is who's filling out the form and how do they perceive it. So legally, any child born in the U.S. Is a U.S. citizen by birth. It's birthright citizenship we have here. It's not terribly common. Most countries have a citizenship based on blood. So you're born to somebody from that has that nationality. You have it. France also has this kind of birthright citizenship. Several other countries. So any child born to immigrants in the U.S. is a U.S. citizen. They are counted in these data as native born. Whoever is filling out the form for those children, though, has to make that determination. So I'm sure there's some fuzziness there.
Roger Mark.
Thank you, Blair, and thank you, Audrey, and thank you for the shout out to the Trinis.
It's a Trini thing, I understand.
So I had a couple of questions, and I wondered whether you could talk about the degree to which, when you look at the immigrant population, how many of these immigrants are skilled immigrants? And I wonder to what degree, for the Washington, D.C. area, there is an attempt to recruit nurses, doctors, teachers from various countries that are coming in. And I know historically in the Caribbean community, Howard University has traditionally been a huge pull for educational purposes. So there may be folks of Caribbean origin who will go to Miami or New York, but ultimately want to come to Washington, D.C. because of Howard University. So I wondered also to what degree you have people coming into other cities but are attracted to Washington, D.C. for other reasons. So skilled migrants, and then the degree to which there's some movement within the country from other regions for migrants coming into D.C.
Thank you. I think I can answer these questions. The first one, how skilled are immigrants in Washington? Actually, I can only answer it to a certain point. I can't talk about Black immigrants or immigrants from any particular region with any statistical authority up here. But I did do a study of the skill levels of immigrants in the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the country. And I was able to calculate which places were tilting towards high-skilled, meaning people with a bachelor's degree or more, and which places tilted towards low-skilled, meaning immigrants with no high school degree at all, and then those that were more balanced. And Washington, D.C., not surprisingly, tilts towards the high-skilled. So I don't remember the exact number. My memory is notoriously bad. But there are well over for every 100 low-skilled immigrants, more than 130 high-skilled immigrants. I think it's higher than that, but I can't remember exactly. And so there are places that have very low levels of immigration, like Pittsburgh, that attract very high-skilled immigrants because they are losing their younger, educated workforce to other places that young people find more desirable. Although I heard Pittsburgh's coming back and it's getting cool. I have a niece there. She can verify that. What we see is that there are places, and part of this has to do with the underlying composition of immigrants that are networked to those places, like the Southwest, which is largely Mexican immigrants. Much lower skills there. Much easier for people to come and find jobs in those kinds of occupations. So there's a lot of variation across places. Washington, again, is very desirable because of the internationalization of work here. A lot of people doing work, that involves other countries in various guises, all of these international organizations. All of the industries that have built up around those organizations, you know, the Beltway Bandits and other supportive industries that draw on the high-skilled are also drawing on immigrant high-skilled workers. So there's a lot going on there. And I wish I could go into more detail about the specific groups that we're interested in today. And then what was the other one?
The role of Howard as
Oh,
university.
Howard, yes. Well, Howard is just one of the many institutions, but it's a very important one, especially for Black immigrants. My colleague at Brookings, Jill Wilson, did her master's thesis on Black immigrants in the US, and she focused on several metropolitan areas, including Washington, D.C., and she did a lot of field work interviewing people about why they chose the places that they did to go to. And in Washington, there were many things that people said, but there were 4 or 5 reasons, and one of them was Howard. It being the nation's capital was another very important reason, which makes this place unique. People, especially from Africa, you know, people are drawn to capital cities. And so going to the nation's capital had meaning for people who weren't even thinking about a lot of other considerations.
Okay, we have a question here, and if you think you have a question, put your hand up. I think we'll have time for a couple more.
Thanks so much, Audrey, for your enlightening presentation. My question has to do with how your research or research like yours kind of informs policy, contributes to the larger kind of immigration hot button discussions that happen. Have you seen it for yourself or for colleagues of yours directly? Have you seen any kind of policy shift based on the research?
Absolutely. Usually the first question I get from an audience is along the lines of, what part of illegal don't you understand? So the kind of research that I do, which tends to be comparative and looking at places and trying to help places understand who they are, I think has been useful just for sort of the identity of places and for them to understand something. So about 10 years ago, I developed a typology of immigrant gateways, which was based on the entire history of immigration in the 20th century and where people went. And it's very clear, you're able to see places that used to draw immigrants in large numbers that are, you know, like Cleveland and Pittsburgh and St. Louis. These are places that no longer draw immigrants in large numbers. So they're former immigrant gateways. And then there are the continuous ones like New York and San Francisco and Chicago. And they've had constant replenishment of diverse groups of people moving in there. And then there's a whole set of emerging, I won't go into the whole typology, but emerging, re-emerging, pre-emerging. In fact, Deborah Mack's talk was talking about the New South, there's Deborah, project, and I worked with that group on Charlotte. And Charlotte was bursting with immigrants very late in the immigration history of this country. So after 2000, things started really growing there, and they had to grapple with what they were. So places, once I did that typology, people could say, oh, that's what we are. We're a re-emerging gateway. We didn't know what that was, but that's what we are, and this is what it means for us. And now we know what we can do to support or try to have discussions around these issues. And so it's gone a lot deeper than that over time. Thanks.
Okay, we have one question here, and then there'll be one more. Anybody wants to? Go ahead.
Thanks for sharing those really revealing numbers. Just a side note, I live in Howard County, Maryland, and my 13-year-old daughter, the majority of all her friends, all their mothers and or both parents are foreign born, from the Caribbean, from Africa, primarily. The other big story, though, taking place in D.C. over the past few decades has been gentrification. So I'm wondering if you can comment on how, if possible, these processes overlap or shape or affect one another, the processes of the immigration and
Yep.
gentrification.
Absolutely, thanks. Well, unfortunately, Howard is not part of the Washington metropolitan area. It's part of Baltimore. But it's one of the most interesting counties to study because of the diversity and the wealth there. And it's sort of, I've been, wanting to kind of poke around there. I'm going to hang out with your daughter and her friends and their parents. A little awkward, but so gentrification. This is, one of those words that we also have to unpack, right? So there's been a lot of neighborhood change, particularly in the district, but also in the inner suburbs, in these sort of denser, more urban-like suburban areas. And there are neighborhoods in the district that have been going through a very long process of controlled gentrification, like Adams Morgan and Mount Pleasant. Those areas, we're almost into the 5th decade of gentrification. And then there are the places that have gentrified very quickly, seemingly overnight, where new buildings are happening all over the city. There have been some studies that show that there are a couple of leading indicators of neighborhood change and gentrification, and one of them is immigrants. And so, particularly in African American neighborhoods, often the first newcomers in 2 or 3 generations of population loss are immigrants. And you could see that in some of the neighborhoods in the district, and here I'm thinking of Columbia Heights as a good example. And once that process gets started, it opens the way. So another leading population of change has been gay men who have moved into neighborhoods and sort of started that process of change. And so there have been some interesting studies that look at those 2 kind of processes, but it happens in so many different places, in so many different ways. It's very hard to really capture it, but often immigrants are part of the process.
Okay, this will be the last question.
Audrey, great talk. And I think this comment kind of dovetails on Sabia's in terms of trying to understand where are the new immigrant enclaves in the D.C. region. You presented a lot of information about numbers and percents throughout of different immigrant populations, but where are the new immigrant enclaves, neighborhoods, and how has that changed over time?
Sure. There are a couple waves of new immigrant neighborhoods in the region. And one of the things that I've looked at is places that are now heavily foreign-born that are in the suburbs. And with my colleague Marie Price, who's at GW, Geography Department, we looked at 5 places in the region that we called edge gateways. So these are densely settled with immigrants. All of them had at least 1/3 of the population that was foreign-born. All of them were in the suburbs. Most of them outside of the Beltway, but some straddling the Beltway. So we looked at, of course, Langley Park. We looked at Gaithersburg. We looked at Herndon, which had a lot of strife around immigration about 10 years ago. We looked at Annandale, and we looked at one more. Wheaton, it was Wheaton, thank you. Yes. And so since we did that study, these places have changed. They're changing so rapidly. And what we looked at was the response to immigration in these places, both official and unofficial. But since then, I would say, when we were doing that study, Prince William County wasn't even on our map. Shortly after we did the study, things kind of exploded in Prince William County. If you remember, in 2007, the county supervisor there led a proposal to crack down on immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, but it had a widespread effect on all immigrants there. And they like to say that they did Arizona before Arizona did Arizona. So at the time, it was the most harsh set of policies that were designed to work against immigrants settling into a region. So that's a place that has had its economic ups and downs since then, but I would say that was one of the newest, biggest places. And then we see a sprinkling around the region of many other places in Loudoun County and as farther out from Manassas as well. So I guess we're going to end now. Thank you all for your questions.
Thank you so much. As we had these smaller conversations, I thought it was very important that we have this keynote to put everything in context. So for right now, enjoy, grab some drinks, and head to our next sessions. If you are interested in educating the diaspora, you're on the 5th floor. If you're interested in gentrification and changing demographics, you're around the corner on the 6th floor. So thank you, everyone. I realized I didn't actually introduce myself before. I'm Ariana Curtis, Curator of Latino Studies at the Anacostia Community Museum and the organizer of this event. So we have 2 more sessions. Enjoy. Thank you.
Audrey, isn't the kind of general pattern that unless their country's been sending immigrants